And so before we get this whole thing together and see how those curves looked on the finished piece, or almost finished piece, I want to get the dowel holes drilled into our leg post. So I've already gone through and done one leg here, and so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing drawboard dowels into our top and bottom stretcher. And so I'm only going to be putting dowels into our horizontal stretchers here because those are the only pieces that are going to be under strain. Our vertical dividers that go in between each of the cherry panels, they're never really going to be under any kind of strain. You're always going to be lifting from the bottom and putting pressure upwards. But what we don't want is for this thing to be easily pulled apart. Now, glue pressure would probably be more than enough, but I want to add these dowels for, strength and looks. And so we're going to be using these really tiny 3/16 dowels. Now, I'm making these using a dowel former from Lee Valley, which is basically just a piece of tool steel with a 3/16 hole in it that you just smash a piece of cherry through. So before we actually go in and mark where our dowel is going to go in our tenons, there's one really important thing to remember. Before you mark those holes, you need to make sure that this thing is 100% ready to go as if you were doing a glue up. So if you guys remember, when we actually made the whole frame of this thing, we made it so that these tenons have some wiggle room to them. They can move up and down about 1/16 of an inch. So what I need to make sure of is that my top stretcher here is flush with the top of my legs on both sides. That's probably one of the most important things before I actually put dowel holes in. And then to mark our dowel holes, we're just going to be using the same 3/16 bit that we used to actually drill the holes in the legs. And because it's a brad point bit, all we have to do is just line it up in the leg and give it a light tap. And so what you don't want to do is, for one, you want to make sure you're using a wooden mallet because you don't want to damage a bit. Bits are not meant to be hammered on with a steel hammer. It's going to do a lot of damage to them. It's not great. Also, you're just going for a nice light tap. What you really don't want to have happen is for the bit to go so deep that the actual outer wings of the cutting edge of the brad point bit touch the wood, because that will end up putting other divots that the bit might grab into later on. Because we're going to be trying to drawbore these, we want to make sure that we can just barely move that little point that we were putting in there. We want to be able to move it over enough to not end up having the bit grab that spot. And so now you can kind of see there's that little dot right on there. It's really hard to see on the walnut, I know, but you can trust me that there is just a little dot that is the exact size of our brad point bit. And so now we want to make sure that we don't mess up any of the alignment. Again, we spent all that time making sure that our top bar was perfectly aligned and that everything is going to pull together super nicely when we pound in these dowels. So we just want to move it just slightly over, barely about a 32nd of an inch really. In this case, because these dowels are so small, we only want to go just barely over. And so all you're going to do is line up just the tip of the brad point bit on the very edge of the dot that you just punched earlier. And so when you're punching this one, what you want to do is you actually want to hit it decently hard so that the wings actually do touch the wood. This will make sure that you're deep enough that that will become the permanent registration hole for the brad point bit to drill into when you take it over the drill press. If you don't hit it hard enough, you may end up sinking the point into that initial bit that you hit earlier. So you're just moving it just barely over, just to the very edge of the one you hit earlier, and that will be just enough to create that drawboring effect. And just like that, we have a pretty much bulletproof system. So as you can see, I left the dowels very proud. They obviously, I want to be able to actually get these out afterwards. So I didn't actually pound them in all the way, so I can still yank them out. But even with them just loosely in, they're only in through one side and a little bit into the tenon, this thing is not coming apart. Even with a hammer, I wouldn't be able to get it apart. And so this is one of the reasons why I invested in a mortiser, and I really like Mortise and Tenon joinery, is mainly because you can drawboard like this. If you're using something like domino joinery or dowels or, I don't know, any of the other options that you have for joinery, none of them are nearly as strong or as useful as just genuine Mortise and Tenon joinery. Now, Mortise and Tenon joinery does take a little bit more time and effort and attention to get it right, but with this kind of a payoff, I can put this whole trunk together without a single clamp needed. And so now we're gonna move on to actually making these dowels. So it's not a super complex process, but it is quite time consuming and painful. And so the two tools you're really going to need for this is a hatchet, because this is really important. We'll get to that in just a second here. And some piece of metal that has a specific hole diameter that you can punch the wood through. So this is a Veritas dowel former. It's a pretty inexpensive thing. The plate, I think, is 15 bucks, and each of these dowel formers, the actual hole, is, I think, 12 bucks. And so the only real benefit to this Veritas set is that it's A2 tool steel, which means it's really strong, really durable, and it's not going to, it's not going to get damaged. It's also a nice thick plate of metal. But what you can do, and I did this in a video in the hickory and walnut bedroom bench that I built a long, long time ago, you can just go to Home Depot or any other hardware store and buy an 1/8" strip of metal. And then you just drill your holes in it with, just a normal spiral bit. And you will need a drill press and, all that kind of stuff. Be very careful with that, yada, yada, yada. But that also does work really well too. That's what I used on that project, and it came out just fine. But I wanted to get this because it's a little bit nicer to work with. And so you can also do cut dowels. Now, this is the smallest dowel cutter that I can afford. Lee Valley does, again, have a big, master dowel cutter system thing that can go down to 3/16 of an inch, and I would like to get it someday, but it's a little bit out of my price range. So this is the 3/8 one that I use on most of my other projects. All my breadboard end tops. 3/8 dowels, I think, just work really well. And this is the smallest size that Lee Valley makes in these things. And so there's a pretty big difference between cut dowels and formed dowels. And so in general, cut dowels are not going to be as strong as formed dowels, because the big difference between them is this tool right here. When you're making cut dowels, you just need a square piece of stock to then spin through the cutting blade, and that will pump out your dowel. But when you're making form dowels, you need to start with a piece of cherry like this. And it looks like a piece of kindling, and that's exactly what you're going for. Because then you go and take this piece and you split it with a hatchet or an axe. And so as you can see with this little 3/16 dowel that I made earlier, is that it does wiggle and move around a lot. But the big difference is that that follows the grain. So it's going to be a much stronger dowel, especially in a situation like this, where it's only 3/4 of an inch long. That 3/4 inch section right down there is plenty long enough to get through this whole thing and still have a good straight section. It's not going to cause any issues if there's a little bit of wiggle through the whole dowel. And so when I'm getting ready for finishing, I like to blend the traditional and the modern techniques. The hand plane does a really good job of getting the surface really smooth and clean and removing any plane or tear out, all that kind of stuff really quickly. And then the sanding lets you work in any direction you want, whether that's chaotic grain, whether it's just nice, clean, straight grain. The sanding works just fine to clean up any of the leftover stuff left by the hand plane. And so there's a certain style I like to do for this that I discovered on the maple dresser that we built in the last project. And I'm going to keep doing it on pretty much every project I do because I really just love the look of it. And so this is our side panel. Currently, this whole side panel, all the parts have been completely finished. And so it's really hard to tell when you're just looking at the flat image, like you guys are on the video, but in person there is a massive difference, and I'll explain it to you here in a second. And so what I've done for the side panel here is just created multiple depths. So our outer legs here are our first depth, they're our thickest or outermost depth. And so that is the reference surface for everything else. Then to create my next level of depth, which is our top and bottom stretcher, I've just simply put a chamfer along the whole length of that piece. Then I've taken the thickness down on our top and bottom stretcher to be exactly lined up with that chamfer. And so the best way to do this is either with a drum sander or a hand plane, or you could do it with hand sanding or a random orbit sander. Just depends on which way you find most accurate. Again, the most important thing to remember here is that your piece no longer needs to be perfectly flat. It's better if it stays flat just because of professionalism, but realistically, if you keep the same thickness in the middle section here and then taper it down on the ends, no one's really ever going to notice the difference, and that's going to be a little bit easier in the long run. And so then once I have the top and bottom stretcher down to a thickness where they're just under that chamfer, I can then go down and put a chamfer on the inside edges of those two pieces as well. Then from there, I got to get the middle divider underneath that depth of that chamfer, which again creates our third depth from our outer leg. So we've got first depth, second depth, and third depth from there. Then the final depth is obviously our cherry panels, which are just below the level of this middle divider. Now these are very close in depth, which again creates that almost flat appearance across here with just a small bump visually in the middle. And the cove profile that we have around the whole piece really just brings it all together. And so you can see here that we're actually removing a decent amount of material when we're making these middle dividers fit up. So the front face here is one that I've got all fitted up. It's all fitting within those bevels nicely, whereas the back side here doesn't fit in yet. And so we are doing this on both sides. Normally, like on the dresser, I only did it on the one side, which was quite easy. Whereas on this thing, I want it to look good from the outside and the inside, so I want to carry this detail on both sides. So on the inside section here, you can see just how thick that still is compared to the front section, which is very thin. So we still have plenty of material there, and it's still in a shallow enough groove that this is still plenty strong. I'm not going to break it. It's not going to get broken when it's actually in the finished piece, but we are taking off quite a lot of material. I think it's about probably close to a 1/16 of an inch off there with the hand plane. So it's not an easy task by any stretch of the imagination. My arms are definitely feeling this. My whole body's actually feeling this process, but it is definitely worth it in the end. All right, and with that, all of our finishing or pre-finishing is done. Everything is nice and smooth. We've got all of our bevels lined up. Everything looks so very good. I'm really happy with how it's turning out. As you can tell from my voice, I am completely exhausted. This finishing process for just the sidewalls of this thing here has taken about 3 days. I started on Saturday. It is now Monday about noon. So definitely not 3 full days, but it feels like a lot longer than that because my body is in a lot of pain right now from this. Because even though this method is definitely much more enjoyable than just standing there sanding with the orbital sander, it is a lot more work, definitely by far. It involves a lot more physical labor. I think I have unintentionally created a set of abs for myself because there's a lot of core muscle strength required, a lot of arms muscle strength. Just all of that stuff that goes into this is quite challenging. So I'm really glad it's done. I'm really happy with how everything looks. And I'm really excited to move on to the nice finishing stage now, where I just get to wipe on some finish easily. And so the thing I want to mention about this whole pre-finishing stage is that when you're working with the low angle jack, try to keep a 38 or 40 degree blade in there. It makes it a lot easier. I started out with a 50, and that was just way too steep of an angle. It did good not to cause any tear out and all that, but I really found that with the amount of material, especially on our middle dividers here that I had to remove, it was not worth the extra effort to avoid tear out. The 40 degree blade did plenty well in avoiding tear out on all these pieces, and then whatever little tear out there was easily cleaned up with 180 grit hand sanding, because when you're hand sanding, you can really get in and just remove it in key areas.